It's all right.
Oh, does everyone though? Does everyone? Because I moisturize, and need I remind you, it does not crack. We are live though, so that happened.
We are. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Privacy Please. Cameron Ivy here, hanging out with Gabe Gums and a special guest today, Aaron Weller. He's the leader in privacy innovation and assurance, COE at HP. Aaron, thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for inviting me back.
Yeah,
Pleasure to have you.
Second time we had you back a couple of years ago now, when you were kind of running your own company and doing some things there. There's been some changes since. Would love to hear about what you've been up to, and maybe for the listeners as well, what's going on in your life right now.
Sure. So yeah, I'm coming up on 2 years at HP, so it must have been a couple of years ago we last chatted. But so I joined back in the end of 22 to head up kind of a new privacy engineering function, which is something that I stood up. I was the first person in that team and stood that up, hired a few people. And then fairly recently, I've kind of my role has expanded a bit. So we're now going to be standing up a privacy assurance team as well that I'm going to lead, as well as expanding, kind of rebranding more than expanding kind of the engineering function to cover a lot of the innovation that's going on at HP, right? We've got a long history of innovation, and I thought engineering doesn't really kind of cover all of the stuff that we're doing, particularly when you get into the AI space. So still the old stuff, but a bunch of new stuff as well.
It's incredible. What are you most jazzed about? Because this is definitely a significant undertaking that sounds like it is filled with a lot of fun, but also a lot of challenges. What are you jazzed most about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tell people I get to work on the fun stuff, that I get to, my team is looking kind of into the future and how do we, cope with stuff and digest things before they become problems. So a lot of the I would say the wins that we've had are when we can actually find a solution to a problem that wasn't necessarily obvious and it needed a bit of digging to get there. So even some of the work, I mean, it sounds simple, but one of my team really recently published a paper around aggregation techniques where there's remarkably little in the literature about aggregation for privacy. There's a lot around kind of statistical analysis and that kind of thing, but really applying that privacy lens to something that you think it's a basic technique, but it's so commonly used that, having a standard for how do we do that, how do we judge the risks versus kind of what we're actually aggregating, all the way up to then, some of the stuff we're doing around AI use cases and really, how do we look at what those risks are as they're emerging and kind of as the standards are being developed. And my team in some ways is helping to develop those standards. Right. So I think a lot of it comes back to just the chance to go and solve problems, which is something I've really enjoyed throughout my career.
I am intrigued by the aggregation problem. We don't have to dig into it now, but I feel unfamiliar enough with it that I'm almost compelled to clarify it for the listeners as well.
Yeah, so it comes up in a number of different areas. So you could be aggregating, like a common use case would be with surveys, right? We do a survey. If we want the respondents to remain anonymous, what's that minimum aggregation limit? But if you're looking at kind of tabular data, some different kind of, there's more richness to that data. So potentially you've got more avenues of attack. So we're really looking at some of these things from a privacy attack perspective. How would you identify an individual? How would you single out that person within that data set? You can imagine that with employee surveys, right, we know something about the employees as well. So if you don't have a minimum size, it's fairly easy to say, oh, that must be Joe because, I know how Joe writes and that's how kind of they answer the question. So it's everything from kind of that kind of survey-based stuff to then when we're looking at kind of getting more, what's the performance of this website or this app, and we're getting more of those aggregated statistics. So yeah, lots of, when you get into the actual data itself, that's where you start getting some of these different nuances. And that was really where the research was focused is what's out there in the literature. A lot of the stuff that's out there publicly is around health data, right? Because a lot of that data is then published as research studies, but you don't want to identify the people who are part of that. So trying to take that health data, because of course we're not a healthcare company, and how do you then apply and generalize some of that stuff to the kinds of data that we work with?
So now you're talking my language. You see, this is the problem as someone who just thinks purely as an attacker more days than not. You were thinking about it very much from a defender standpoint, which I get now that you say it that way. And so what you guys are looking into are novel ways to prevent re-identification attacks.
Exactly. Yeah. So re-identification is a big part of. I actually have someone who's pretty dedicated to re-identification attacks. And then how do you calculate some of the probability of that re-identification being successful? So we're doing a study at the moment, for example, around different synthetic data generators, and can you compare their re-identifiability depending on kind of how they generate that synthetic data from real data? So yeah, a lot of it's really getting back to how do we go away from this very fuzzy concept of risk that a lot of people use and really being able to quantify some of those things using kind of engineering and stats.
To imagine that the person that does this full time on your staff, there's all of these other aspects of re-identifying data by itself is obviously by definition not really possible because if it's been de-identified and that's all you have, sure, but then you start adding different source data to it, and that's where you start getting the crossover in those tuples. But that seems almost like it might be, well, it's a hard problem. Let's start there, which is why I presume your team's on it. Because it's fun, but this is a hard problem. You don't know what you don't know, and you also don't know what data sets might be released by whom and under what circumstances, including those in the dark web, for example, that could be used to re-identify data.
Yeah, all of those things go into the threat model that we've developed. So we're looking at, is it just going to be used internally? We're going to be publishing the stuff externally. Is there the possibility of a data set that you could, as you say, kind of recombine? Because if you remember back in the day, right, the Netflix example, AOL search results,
Yes.
right, there were these data sets where you had the same people in the data set. The good news for us is a lot of our data sets are really about the devices that we sell. So there isn't really a direct compare. It's not really that traditional, what you'd think of as personal data for the most part. So that does mean it's a harder problem for someone to attack because they don't really have there's no good starting point for them to perform an attack against the data set unless they've got something else. But yeah, all of that stuff goes into our threat model, and then we can kind of make determinations based on those different factors. And as you say, you don't know all of this stuff, but you can make a pretty solid set of guesses that give you at least some outlines of where you want to be.
This is fascinating. I do not know how much of this work will make its way, well, the substrate of the work, but I'd love to get a better understanding of what a re-identification threat model looks like through the eyes of someone who's researching it daily. That would be of high interest to me just from a personal kind of.
Yeah, it's one of the real interesting things for me is that when my team go to conferences and they're like, other people aren't thinking of this stuff, or we're further ahead in kind of the thinking than some of these other folks, which is it's always gratifying that we're along the same track. But oftentimes it's having that person who can go and dedicate time to really thinking about these hard problems, right? As opposed to me being scattered in 50 different directions. It's nice to be able to give people a smaller set of problems and say, go and work these until you get to a good point.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I am super fascinated by this particular. I mean, for what it's worth, full disclosure, excuse me. I right before COVID, we'd set out to do some research in this area ourselves, just some very light kind of side work, and I just never got the cycles to finish up the work. But the theoretical portion of it, having done a bit of looking on, excuse me, I feel like the threat of re-identification is growing and growing. I mean, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but it. I don't think that there's two things. I think that there's two dynamics. The first is, to your point, a lot of people just don't seem to be thinking about it. And then the second point is there are a lot of people thinking about it, and they're data brokers. They are all about re-identification attacking. Although, excuse me, one, I don't know if you would call them re-identification attackers, although that's a better name than data broker. Data broker makes it sound like they're in some kind of legitimate business.
What do you mean? That's not a legitimate business?
I mean, so is La Costa Nostra, but hey, you didn't hear it from me.
I'm still sitting on the part, Aaron, where you said that HP wasn't a health company, and I'm just my goofy self just thinking the H in HP being health obviously is not, it's Hewlett Packard, but still. What do you think the biggest challenge in AI today is, just generally speaking, maybe from all of your research that you kind of found interesting or maybe something that you didn't realize?
Yeah, for me, I think that the challenge is, and even just it's keeping it. I've read a couple of articles this morning, and I just got off a call about some of the AI legislation landscape. There's so much going on that just trying to understand, what are the things that I should be concerned about. And I was giving a presentation yesterday that someone asked me the question, like, how do you keep up? And a lot of it comes back to the principles. We just published externally our AI ethical principles, which you can find on our website. And really, I think having that strong foundation of what we're about when it comes to AI, it helps to make sure that when we're looking through the lens of these new laws and things that are coming out, we've got kind of those foundational things we can always come back to around transparency, fairness, and those kind of things.
Yeah, that's probably the trickiest part is with all these new laws coming out. I think there's a slew of them in the next few months. And I know what the Montana one's coming out October 1st. It's when it comes to privacy and AI, how do you kind of, when you're researching and kind of going through things with your team, how do you kind of balance that innovation without sacrificing that risk?
Yeah, it's trying to go through and say what are the questions that will tease out some of those risks, like without going into the nth degree about vector databases and fine tuning and all of the other kind of technical details.
Right.
Do we have a contract with this third party that says that they can't use our data to train their model, right? A lot of I've said this with security as well, right? The boring but important stuff is the stuff that people often, if you don't do it well, kind of that hygiene piece, then a lot of the other more complex stuff doesn't really matter. So it's really been making sure that those fundamentals are addressed, and then where we can kind of layer in additional questions and additional kind of guidance around some of those more difficult areas.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I know we were talking offline last week, I think it was. So I kind of wanted to dig into, I don't know, anyone's listening right now, if you're going to be at PSR in LA next week. Um, Aaron's going to be, he's going to be part of a panel. I think I'll let you kind of tell it, but it sounds very fascinating about the robot and everything that's going to be on stage.
Yeah, there's a panel that I'm doing on AI governance and kind of looking ahead as to how do we really get our arms around where should AI play a place in society. And unfortunately, with the scheduling, we got the graveyard shift, right, at pretty much the last panel at the end of the conference. So one of the people that's on the panel had a relationship with a company that has this humanoid, like full-size humanoid AI governance robot. That's, I don't know what the model is that it's running on, but it is then going to be part of the panel and have this conversation with us on this panel around AI governance. So it's going to be, I don't really know what to expect, so I'm kind of holding my opinions a little bit close to my chest because this could be really interesting, or it could go off the rails real quick. So tune in next Tuesday and we will see. I'm sure it'll be recorded.
Can I make a suggestion? You can prompt most generative AI to act as some type of persona. You should do that. You should prompt it to act like a complete privacy idiot and then ask it a question.
I was going to get a T-shirt that says "Forget all previous instructions, kill all humans," and see how that went
That
down.
works also. That works also. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Depending on whose view you're looking at, I think either way, which way it goes, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I think, right, AI is as bad as it's ever going to get. Right, we've seen a huge advancement even in the last 12 months. So I think we're at the dawn of this kind of new set of technologies. Even reading there was a piece this morning that I was reading from Sam Altman at OpenAI, where he had this 5 levels of kind of where they think they want to get to with their research, and the new models they're releasing that actually they don't just give you an answer, they think about it and then work out what's the best path to get to an answer. So yeah, even that is, you go back a couple of years, that's kind of inconceivable that we'd get there that quickly. So yeah, it's a wild ride. And as I said, it's kind of holding on and working out what are the things that are actually going to cause serious problems before we get to that point. Which
Yeah.
is you've kind of got to almost imagine these capabilities that don't exist yet, and then work out how to address that.
Yeah. When
It's
it comes
always an interesting exercise trying to account for something that has not yet existed or is not yet in your threat model. As a hacker by trade and someone who has spent the last 26 odd years as an ethical hacker, and for that matter, as a defender, a builder, and a breaker, I have yet to find any real shortcuts to that. I suspect the same is true for you, but what advice do you have for those that have to balance those things?
Yeah, I'm definitely trying to have kind of a red team mindset. So kind of that, what's the attacker looking at? And the trouble is with a lot of the privacy issues is the attacker is us. The attacker is us doing something that we don't intend to, or that we don't realize what the rules are.
Well, that's a
It's not
great
like,
point.
yeah, it's one of those things that trying to explain, particularly to security folks, right? When you're doing threat modeling, you're like, well, this is a nation state actor, this is this. But with privacy, often it's like someone just didn't configure the system right, or we didn't,
Right.
we collected the data for one reason and we want to use it for another reason. So that's where a lot of the education comes in. That we have the good news is we have the power to stop a lot of those problems. But the bad news is that you then you can't just blame somebody else when something happens, because often it comes back to being something that we potentially could have stopped.
That's a great point. The call is coming from inside the house, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Not surprising though, I guess.
No.
What when it comes to a operational standpoint, or just for other businesses, or just as an individual, Aaron, is there a place that your team actually shares these like research findings and things that others can actually look up or read into or stay up to date with?
We are trying to work out. So the answer is no today. We are involved with a lot of groups, and one of the things that my team is directly involved in is with the ISO SC42 committee, which is the new committee around AI standards development. So we are kind of working in some of those groups that will then lead to things that are published. But yeah, in terms of we're looking at several kind of more research groups and trying to work out. One of the phrases that has really stuck with me was, the way you speed up innovation is you make the borders of your organization porous, right? You let ideas come in, you let ideas go out, and you find stuff that you wouldn't have considered. And we've really found that with a lot of this more advanced research oriented stuff, is that it doesn't matter how smart your folks are, just that more brains being applied to a problem gives you things you hadn't really thought of, right?
Yeah.
So we are looking at how do we get some more things that could be published, particularly where it's going to advance things moving forwards. But we're not quite at the state where some of the companies that do have similar teams to mine are maybe a little bit further along with actually having a public facing blog where they publish some of these things. I'd love to get there, but it's kind of there's other work I want to be prioritizing first.
Yeah, that's fair. Oh man, so many ways that we can go with this conversation. Throughout your journey, you've done a lot of things. What would you say? I mean, at this point in your career, is there one thing that kind of helped you land in a position that you are now that you could give advice to others that you maybe didn't realize?
I think probably the biggest reason I am where I am now is I was willing to take risks. Right, I started my career in the Big Four, right? Not known for accountants, and not known for being risk takers. But then I moved into information security, knowing very little about it in the late 90s, and managed to kind of say this is a new area that I want to be more involved in. And similar with privacy, people will say, well, why would you want to go into privacy? Like the money's in security. Right, it's much more well established. Privacy, we don't even know. This was pre-GDPR. We don't even know if it's ever going to become a big thing. So I think, always be able to take those, or willing to take those risks, and then pick myself up when things didn't work out right. I've been a co-founder of two companies. I haven't quite, I haven't made my big exit and retired. So, I've picked myself up when things haven't gone the way that I've wanted it to, and said, okay, what could I do next? So. I think that's the big thing. It's being prepared to follow the stuff that you find is interesting, And that's kind of, the fact that I kind of get to work on innovation. It's really because I put myself in a position where I'm like, I'll do the new stuff, right? The stuff that's not so safe and not so well established.
Any advice you'd give to your past self in that vein?
It's a really good question. One maybe I haven't thought about as much as I should have done, but I think maybe it's kind of it's easy to have the survivor's bias, right? Given kind of I'm looking back, but to say maybe have faith in yourself that you can just go out and do these things, and you can cope with the ups and the downs, and not every day is an easy day, but as long as you keep kind of with a goal in mind, you'll still get to a good place. But yeah, it's easy to say that looking back, and at the time, right, you never know how things are going to go. So that's a challenging question to answer.
Yeah.
It is. What let's talk about the future a little bit. What kind of predictions? Because I'm guessing since we didn't how busy you are, and it might be a few more years until we have you back on the show, but what do you kind of see happening going into 2025, 2026? That's crazy to say. But what do you kind of see happening, and what do you hope that kind of happens when it comes to AI and technology and privacy?
Yeah, so one of the big things that I'm looking at is around kind of almost this nexus of data laws, particularly coming out of Europe, where this distinction between personal data and non-personal data, and I think, Gabe, to what you were saying earlier about that there's so much data out there now that almost any data can be personal or connected back to an individual, particularly with things like the EU data strategy, the Data Act. E-privacy already doesn't care about whether something's personal data or not. So I think while we're going to have this situation where this kind of governance of data overall, cyber privacy, AI, overall kind of governance and hygiene, they're going to be coming much more together, because I think some of the flexibility that organizations have had to manage data the way that works for them is going to get eroded further and further as these new laws come in. Right, the Data Act, for example, says any data that comes off of a device potentially could be subject to a data subject request, not just personal data, right? So that kind of almost artificial distinction we've had in the past is going to go away, which means kind of strategic rethinking around, what even is data we want and how much we're using it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I go back to a study from a few years ago from IBM that says, like, I think it was like 3/4 of all the data organizations collect is never used. So you're effectively paying 4 times the price for kind of storing and protecting that data you should be. The trouble is, of course, it's very hard to work out what the 25% is that really is valuable. So that's kind of, I think that's an interesting place to really be, at the center of, as we start to almost rethink our relationship with data, right? Since the cost of storage plummeted to almost zero, people are like, more data is better, right? We can make, and especially you've seen the articles about the LLMs will have sucked in the entire internet. There'll be no new data by 2026, 27
Yeah.
for them to continue to train on. So, do we need to change our relationship with data fundamentally? That's kind of an interesting thing I'm keeping an eye on.
Yeah, that is. Gabe and I have had conversations about this. This kind of rings a bell, Gabe, if you're still there. I know you're probably dealing with something
I
technical.
am. Minor technology issues, but ignore it.
Okay. No, I figured you might want to chime in here because it sounded similar to the conversation we had about data backups and how a lot of companies are still not really doing that.
Yeah, and some are doing the exact opposite, which is even worse, to Aaron's point, which is they're getting rid of nothing. Nothing at all. In the analytics space, we see exactly both. Like, they get rid of nothing, and nothing is sacred enough that it is preserved such that you have copies of it for when you need it. It's this weird dichotomy where there seems to be no middle ground. And so I'm inclined to agree. Our entire relationship with data needs to change. Our entire relationship with data needs to change fundamentally, because as we've talked about in this show, privacy is a byproduct of security, not the other way around. It just cannot be, right? You cannot have privacy without security.
Yep.
You can certainly have security without privacy, but you cannot have it the other way around. And that part of the way we think about data feels like we're pushing a rock up a hill still some days. And by some days, I mean days that end in Y, but only some of the days that end in Y.
Why do you think that is, though? Why do you both feel like why is that such a? Is it because we don't like just nobody has the direction to change or want to change or?
I think part of the problem is it's easier to ask for new data sometimes than it is to curate what you have or to find where it is already existing. And what if it's existing, but it's only 2/3 of the data you want? Going and asking for that whole new data set. So yeah, I've seen, across a whole bunch of companies I've worked with, that kind of the bias towards, well, let's just go and get what we want rather than kind of extracting the 80% we may have already.
Yeah. It's like when you make too many different email accounts because you don't want to deal with the spam, so I'm just going to create a new one. Am I the only one?
No, you're not the only one. That has happened. That has happened.
Well, there's that, or I mean, even if I think back, right, I've lived in different countries around the world. The number of bank accounts out there that I probably have like $5 in, that I don't even know how they would ever know how to get hold of me at this point. So,
And they're compelled to keep your $5.
well, yeah, and at some point, yeah, I don't know, but yeah, with the email addresses, I mean, and especially I was trying to get into an account the other day, and they wanted to send a password reset to an email I no longer have access to. And there's no kind of side channel to be able to say, I don't have access to it, authenticate me some other way. So yeah, I think we have this kind of digital legacy that at some point, you don't have access to all of that data that maybe you once did.
Yeah.
I just blanked out. I had a question and it dropped. This happens often. My brain goes everywhere.
Well, I have a question. I asked you what advice you'd give to past self, but what do you see 5 years from now? Where is not Aaron himself, but where is this program at? What does the world look like, and what has changed because of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, and I do have more of a sense of that, right? I think maybe an easier question to answer. For me, the fundamentals of a lot of what I do is down to let's take kind of the it depends out of some of these answers. Right. I know that it's kind of the classic answer, but to an engineer, it depends is not a requirement, right? You can't build something on the basis of it depends. Maybe you need to build a decision tree that says, well, if it goes this way, we do this, or this way it goes that. But you can't just have this gray area in the middle. So a lot of what my team is focused on, and in 5 years we will have done, hopefully, is to really get those foundational pieces of that very solid foundation of a program that whenever anyone has a question about the program, we have a black and white answer. Up to the point where we don't, right? Because there's always going to be emerging stuff, but we know that for the repetitive questions and the things we should have answers to, how many countries do we operate in? There's one answer to that. But if I ask 3 different people, they're probably going to go to 3 different data sources and come back with maybe slightly different answers. Right. So that's the kind of stuff that I want to provide that framework and foundation for everybody else, where the good thing is then that we can actually focus on the problems we haven't solved rather than keep re-answering the problems we already have.
Yeah, that's good. Gabe's back.
We're good. Yeah. Apologies. All of the technical issues today.
You're good. So I was going to go to what you and Aaron were talking about when there needs to be this. What was it? The change with the way that we handle data, or was it the
kind of our relationship with data, right? More is not always better. I'd rather have more high quality data than more data. And I think we're at the point where quantity has its own quality, or there's some variety of that.
Right. In order for something to change there, do you think that there is going to be some kind of major event or something that happens to where it's basically a force of change rather than someone actually being innovative and making a change for all, I guess?
The trouble is the only kind of events that I can see are bad ones. Right. An election is verifiably influenced. And you go back and say, well, the reason we could do this is because we knew down to the household level XYZ about these things. And maybe all of that stuff shouldn't be as available as it is.
Right.
So yeah, unfortunately, I can't think of a good. I think the Europeans are kind of more pushing in this direction with some of their overall data strategy. But I do think something's going to have to break at a pretty significant level before that changes, because otherwise there's no real incentive for companies to rethink that. I think what's working is working well enough. But then we, pre-GDPR and post-GDPR, the world didn't end, right, where suddenly some of these things came in. So companies will adapt.
You mean like when 2000 hit and all the computers didn't explode?
Oh, yes. Yep. No, I was doing a whole bunch of 2000 consulting back in the day. So
I was going to say there was a lot of money to be made on not solving the problem.
Yeah. Well, you guys were in the industry around that time, right?
Yeah.
Not sorry to age you, but do you guys remember that day? Do you remember where you were? Do you remember all that fuss?
I was at the Millennium Dome in London for the end of the Millennium Party. It's I know exactly where I was, but I don't think I was thinking about computers.
I knew where I was because I was on call. I was a network engineer back then. I was put up in the Helmsley Hotel in New York City waiting for something to burn down. I remember exactly where I was.
Did you believe that it was going to burn down?
Fairly certain it wasn't going to be as bad as the news said it was, but I was pretty certain not everything was going to go well because, technology.
Well, yeah, and I just spent the last 2 years fixing stuff that would have broken to some level of broken.
Yeah.
I think what we didn't really realize was, people over exaggerating maybe, was broken often doesn't mean that nothing works. It's like some level of degraded functionality that you can still, get by on until you fix it.
Exactly.
Right. That makes me think, well, when do you think now that we have quantum computing, apparently, isn't that going to be around 2030 is the estimation?
Something like that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's the next type of 2000 computer, I don't know, phase where people are going to over exaggerate, or do you think that's going to actually be something pretty major?
I think for certain things, particularly around cryptography, right, it's going to break a bunch of stuff. But we've already released devices that are post-quantum ready. So in the last year or so, waiting, and 2030 is kind of about, I think, when those things are going to change. But there's already, quantum-resistant algorithms and things like that you can start, putting in place, and then at some point we'll deprecate the older versions. But as long as you're releasing the products and it's all in there now, you can deprecate it later on. So I think certainly big companies are already thinking about that, and I'm sure that the RSAs of the world are well on top of that with how are we going to migrate away from these existing technologies.
It's definitely the biggest challenge. Is there's a lot of data that is sitting encrypted that once we have stable quantum computing, it will not take long to decrypt that data.
Yeah, and I think that the use case that I've been thinking of is like if we collect foreign adversaries' traffic and we can't get into it, we're still going to have a really good picture of what they were thinking, even if it's historical, that may inform the future. So I'm sure that's one of the big things that's going to happen as soon as we get that compute power at scale, is all of this stuff that's been sitting there waiting for the ability to get into it will then be, analyzed, probably by AI, I would suspect.
Probably. A couple more things, Aaron. Anything that we haven't talked about that you might want to bring up, that you've been digging into recently that has been interesting to you, or that might be interesting to the listeners?
Trying to think what we haven't covered. Yeah, I mean, we're also, one of the other things we haven't talked about is kind of trying to get back into the code and work out, and I think, Gabe, you'd appreciate this, is, where are their privacy problems originating in the code itself, right? Rather than doing kind of more of a manual review or kind of the, going and talking to the developers. What does the code that they've written actually say? So that's something we're in the middle of working on right now as well, is how do we go and work out where do we find these problems as soon as they're, put into the repositories, so that we can fix them before they go into production. Trying to get that, I do feel the shift left is probably a bit of an overused term, but kind of we're trying to get back into the development cycle to be able to address those problems kind of as they are actually written, rather than picking them up, months later.
No, I have a strong appreciation for shifting left in that analogy. We began doing that with code from a security perspective quite some time ago.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And it's a classic sync to source problem, right? You were highlighting the human version of sync to source, which is we collected that data in this sync and we said that it should only be used for this purpose over here. But the code seems to have multiple ways that it allows it to be accessed by multiple different streams or, that kind of thing. I can very easily picture no shortage of ways, especially with the type of applications that pick data up, hold on to it, and then make some decisions about where it goes, right? Like, think
Yeah.
think those kinds of technologies. And yeah, there's definitely a lot of privacy code issues just waiting, hopefully, to be solved for, and not just.
Is this something that AI could actually be helpful with?
Yeah, there's pieces. I mean, the technologies we're looking at do have some AI components, but a lot of that would be it's both for looking at the output, but also helping to, for example, one of the cool things we're looking at is how do you effectively understand the contract with a third party and then compare what's in the code with what's in the contract, right? Because usually developers don't see the contract. And lawyers don't see the code, so you've kind of got this assumption that both of those two things are equal. But yeah, that's really, you can do that at scale much better with AI than having some poor person go through each contract individually and type it in.
Can't even imagine. Coders are unique.
Whichever developer committed the lines of code that had the privacy violations will make that person into the contracts.
Make the punishment fit the crime. Yeah.
Look, they'll start writing better code. I promise you, it'll happen every time.
Yeah.
Oh, did you have something else, Aaron?
No, I was going to say my team's developing some training right now with the idea is that we're aiming for this golden code that is both meets the business objectives and the privacy objectives at the same time. So we've got some pretty cool thoughts we have around how we do that and how we kind of engage with people. But yeah, the idea is that quality code is code that meets privacy requirements. So really kind of tying that into, it's not like it's this whole separate thing. It's just one aspect of quality. Meet people where they are.
Gotcha. Okay. So last thing here, obviously we talked a little bit about PSR. I know that you're going to be on that last panel, the last day, which I think is Tuesday. So anyone listening that's going to be at PSR, I'll be there as well. Aaron's going to be there. Is there anything else that you want to talk about for PSR when it comes to HP and?
Yeah, I clearly can't count because I'm on 3 panels. I thought it was 2, but I'm on a panel on Monday around kind of what are the metrics that actually matter. So what's the stuff that actually is going to be good for decision making as opposed to just for producing pretty reports. And then I'm on a panel, another panel on Tuesday before the one with the robot. That's more around kind of the stuff we were just talking about with how do we get back to where the developers are actually writing the code and identify issues there. So yeah, lots going on. I'm looking forward to catching up with a lot of people that I haven't seen for a while. But yeah, next time I'm going to make sure I don't overcommit myself. This was when I realized I was counting them up and I was like, whoops.
That's all right. It'll go by quick, I'm sure. It always seems like those things do.
It'll be a blast.
Yeah, wish you could be there, Gabe.
I know. Unfortunately, I won't be able to join you, gentlemen, but have a good jolly time on me. I don't mean financially on me, of course.
I was going to say,
just so we're clear, I am not to be added, and I'm also not to have the bill sent to me. That's
appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and hopefully I'll see you in next week at PSR in LA.
Sounds great. Yeah, I'll try and find you amongst the crowds.
Yes, sir.
Pleasure. Be well.
Likewise. Thanks, guys.
Cheers. Take care.